Hey, my name is Caleb Ashford. I'm 31 years old, and for 3 years I've lived in the upstairs half of a divided Victorian house on Thistlewood Lane in Asheville, North Carolina, directly above a woman the entire street believed was my wife. I was standing at my kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, sorting through the mail Theo had left in the shared basket by the front door the same way he'd left it for 3 years, when I found the envelope that ruined my whole week before 8 a.m. It was addressed to Sadie Winslow. Heavy cardstock, the kind of paper that costs real money to mail, with final notice stamped across the top in red ink that hadn't faded even after however many days it had been buried under a stack of my seed catalogs and her book club flyers. I flipped it over. The return address said Faro Property Holdings. My stomach did something unpleasant. Underneath the postmark, in smaller print, sat a line that made my hands go cold. Acknowledgement of receipt required by the date below, or the right of first refusal would be considered waived entirely. The date was today, not this week, today. I was still holding it when Mrs. Alvarez from 2 doors down called out from her porch, watering can in hand, asking if I could tell my wife her hydrangeas were about to take over the property line again. I didn't correct her. I'd stopped correcting people around year 2. It was easier to let Thistlewood Lane believe what it wanted to believe. Sadie and I had shared a mailbox, a porch, a landlady, and roughly 400 awkward doorway exchanges over 3 years. But we had never once shared a dinner that wasn't really a 5-minute conversation about a misdelivered package. As far as this street was concerned, we'd been married since before the Prentice twins were born, which by neighborhood chronology was a very long time. I looked at the envelope again. Final notice. Today. I didn't bother with shoes. I went down the outside stairs 2 at a time in my socks, because whatever this was, it wasn't going to wait for me to look presentable. The stairs down to her door were the same ones I'd walked at least once a week since the night I moved in, back when the movers confused the address and left 2 boxes in my kitchen that weren't mine, including a lamp I'd never seen in my life. I carried it downstairs at 11 that night and knocked on the door below mine, trying to figure out whether it belonged to whoever lived there. It did. She opened the door already laughing, because the movers had left an equal number of my boxes at her place in exchange, and for the next 20 minutes we stood in the shared entryway trading kitchen items back and forth like some kind of ceremony neither of us had signed up for. The house had been one house once, split down the middle sometime in the 50s, and whoever assigned the numbers afterward had given my unit 42 Thistlewood Lane and hers 42 Thistlewood Lane as well, with a small handwritten A and B on the mailbox that nobody in 70 years had bothered to make permanent. Every delivery app defaulted to the same PIN. Every substitute carrier treated us as one household. Theo, who'd had this route 11 years and knew better, still left everything in a single basket by the shared door, because separating it, he told me once, felt like more trouble than it was worth for 2 people who were always in and out of each other's space anyway. That was true, in its way. I'd fixed her garbage disposal once. She'd left a jar of soup on my step the week I got back from a brutal shift. No note, just soup. Because she'd heard the ambulance idling outside at 4 in the morning, and put it together that I was the guy from upstairs and not a burglar. We were not a couple. We had simply become the kind of neighbors who existed in each other's peripheral vision so constantly that everyone else on the street had filled in the blank the easy way. I knocked on her door harder than I meant to. She opened the door, still turned halfway toward the shop behind her, calling something back over her shoulder about a stack of paper. And behind her I could see the front room of the shop she ran out of her unit, Sparrow Press, the one where she bound little leather journals and printed other people's wedding invitations, which struck me for the first time as a strange kind of irony, given everything this street believed about the 2 of us. "You look like someone died." I held up the envelope instead of answering right away, because I hadn't figured out how to say the rest of it out loud yet. She took it from my hand, read the return address, and I watched her face do the thing faces do when the floor changes shape underneath them without warning. Faro Property Holdings, she read. That's Adeline. That's Adeline, I agreed. She tore the envelope open right there in the doorway, and I stood close enough to read over her shoulder without asking permission, which felt like something we'd earned the right to do with each other by now, whatever this was. The letter ran 2 pages, dense with the kind of language lawyers use to make bad news sound procedural. Adeline was selling the house. She'd owned it 40 years, since her husband passed, and she was tired, and a company called Holloway Realty Partners had offered more than the place was worth to knock down the dividing wall and flip it as a single listing. And Adeline, being Adeline, had written a tenant right of first refusal clause into both our original leases years ago that neither of us had ever read past the first paragraph. Sadie read the relevant part out loud, slow. Current household tenants of 42 Thistlewood Lane retain 30-day first right to purchase at appraised value, contingent on written acknowledgement of this notice within the response window indicated above. She flipped back to the first page, to the date that had gone cold in my chest an hour earlier. The response window is today, she said. If we don't sign for this today, the option's gone before it even starts. She looked up at me. Household, she repeated, singular. The cold thing in my stomach got colder. I think, I said, we should go talk to Adeline. Adeline lived in the carriage house behind the property, close enough that she'd probably watched half our doorway exchanges over the years from her kitchen window without either of us knowing it. She took one look at the letter in Sadie's hand and sighed like she'd been waiting for this exact moment for weeks. I told my nephew not to send that until I'd spoken to you both myself. She waved us inside. He's a lawyer. Lawyers ruin everything with paper. She put the kettle on without asking if we wanted tea, which meant we were having tea. We sat on the same side of a small round table, close enough that our knees touched underneath it, and neither of us moved to fix that. Adeline told us the truth in pieces, the way people do when they know the truth is about to complicate something. She was 76. Her husband Desmond had died 9 years ago, and she'd kept renting the house because it gave her somewhere to walk to that wasn't just her own 4 walls, and because she genuinely liked us in the specific way landladies like tenants who don't cause trouble. She was tired now in a way that had nothing to do with the house and everything to do with a heart specialist in Charlotte she'd been putting off seeing for months. Holloway had made their offer nearly a year earlier. She'd been sitting on it, hoping something would change her mind about letting the place go. And then last spring, she said, I went to update the lease file for the county, and I realized I've had the 2 of you listed as a married household since the year Caleb moved in. Sadie went very still beside me. You what? Adeline had the decency to look sheepish. You have to understand, you 2 moved in 8 months apart, and within a year you were fixing each other's disposals and leaving soup on porches, and I simply wrote it the way it looked from where I was standing. I've been meaning to correct it. It never seemed urgent. She sipped her tea like this was a minor filing error, and not the reason her nephew had just sent us a legal document treating us as a single household with 30 days to buy our own home together, or lose it to a company that, from what any of us could tell, planned to gut the place and sell it to someone who'd never once met Mrs. Alvarez's hydrangeas. Can't you just fix the paperwork? I asked. I could, Adeline said, but Holloway's offer doesn't expire for 30 days either, and once I correct the file, the clause reverts to 2 separate first refusals instead of 1 household refusal. And neither of you can afford this house alone at appraised value. I've seen both your bank statements, dears, from the rent checks. I'm not being cruel, I'm being honest. She got up, crossed to the counter, and came back with a small brass-framed photograph I'd never once noticed on my dozen visits to that kitchen. Adeline, maybe 30 years younger, standing on the same porch Sadie and I crossed every day, a man beside her with his arms slung easy around her shoulders. "Desmond and I bought this place the year we married," she said, setting the frame where we could both see it. "Neither of us had a dime. We split the mortgage with his brother for the first 6 years before we could afford to buy him out and finally have the whole house to ourselves." She looked at the photograph a moment longer than she needed to, then turned it face down on the table, which told me more about how much she still missed him than anything she'd said out loud. People forget a household isn't a feeling you're born already having. It's a thing you build, slowly, usually by accident, usually with someone you never planned on. The kitchen went quiet enough that I could hear the brass clock ticking on Adeline's wall, a thing that had probably ticked through worse conversations than this one. "So we'd have to actually," Sadie started, and didn't finish the sentence, because neither of us wanted to be the one who said the word first. Adeline, who apparently had no such hesitation, said it for her. "Be a household," she offered, mild as a paint chip. "For real, I mean, whatever that looks like to the two of you. You have 30 days to decide if the life this street already believes you're living is one you actually want, or you both start packing." She refilled her own cup. "I'd start today if I were you. 30 days goes faster than you'd think at 76. We didn't talk about it again that day. We walked back to the house in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as full, the kind where two people are doing math in their heads and don't want to say the numbers out loud yet. But something shifted after that afternoon, the way weather shifts before you can name what changed about the air. I started coming down after shifts instead of going straight up. Sadie started leaving her shop door propped open on the evenings I usually got home, which I noticed because by then I noticed everything about her in the specific and slightly alarming way a person notices things about someone they've spent 3 years pretending not to think about. She taught me to run the letterpress one night, guiding my hands on the lever with more patience than I deserved given how badly I mangled the first 4 cards. Ink smeared to my wrist, ruining a run of wedding invitations for a bride named Vanessa, who would never know how close her save-the-dates came to disaster. "You're better at starting hearts than saving cards, apparently," she said, looking at my crooked printing, and I told her something back about restarting an actual heart once in the back of a moving ambulance, and how this letterpress had bested me completely, and she laughed hard enough to set the lever down. I'd liked that laugh for 3 years without letting myself admit that liking someone's laugh from 1 floor away for 3 years was its own kind of confession. We ran into each other at the grocery store 2 days later, both of us reaching for the same dented can of crushed tomatoes, and the cashier, a college kid who couldn't have worked this street more than a summer, rang up our combined cart without asking and said, "You two want that split? Or is it all going on the family card?" Neither of us corrected him. Sadie just handed over her card. "Family card's fine," she said, so easily that it took the whole walk home for me to realize she might have meant it as a joke, and I'd spent 2 blocks hoping she hadn't. We split the bags on her kitchen counter afterward, out of habit, the way we'd always divided a shared cart even on the trips neither of us had planned to shop together. She caught me staring at the receipt like it might explain something the letter hadn't. "It's not that complicated. I get the pasta, you get the sauce. We've done this for 2 years. I wasn't looking at the groceries. I was looking at how naturally the total had split itself, at how none of this, not one part of it, had ever needed correcting until a company with a boardroom decided it did. The Thistlewood Lane block party happened 9 days after Adeline's tea, an annual thing the street took far too seriously, with a paper banner and a folding table of potluck dishes that somehow appeared every year without anyone officially organizing it. Mrs. Alvarez cornered us by the lemonade with the triumphant energy of a woman who'd been right about something for 3 years running. 4 years, she announced to the small cluster of neighbors who'd gathered, raising her cup. 4 years since the Ashfords moved onto this street, and not one noise complaint between them, which is more than I can say for the newlyweds at 46. I opened my mouth to correct the number, the timeline, the entire premise, and felt Sadie's hand find mine under the folding table before I got a word out. "Closer to 3.5, she said instead, smiling, squeezing my fingers once, hard, a signal I understood without needing it translated. But who's counting? The street toasted us. We drank to an anniversary that had never happened, for a marriage that didn't technically exist, surrounded by people who'd loved us enough to simply decide, years ago, that what they could see with their own eyes mattered more than the paperwork. I looked at Sadie over the rim of a paper cup, and something passed between us that had nothing to do with lemonade. We fixed the porch railing together the following Saturday. Badly. Both of us useless with a drill, swapping the same 3 tools back and forth, and blaming each other for every stripped screw. There was a night on the shared porch, the 2 front doors facing each other across 4 feet of painted wood, when she sat down beside me with 2 mugs of the tea Adeline had gotten her hooked on, and neither of us said anything for a long time. And it wasn't the empty kind of quiet. It was the kind where you're both aware of exactly how close your hands are on the railing, and neither of you moves them. 30 days, she said finally. 22, now, I told her. You're counting. I'm a paramedic. I count everything. She glanced at me sideways. Do you want this? The house, I mean. I should have told her yes immediately. Instead, I said, I want to know what you want first. A coward's answer dressed up as a considerate one, and I think we both knew it, because she pulled her hands back into her lap, and the moment closed like a door easing shut instead of slamming. 2 days later, a car neither of us recognized pulled up outside, a silver sedan too clean for our street, and a man in a suit that only fits people who've never once worried about rent knocked, not on my door, but on hers. I was on the porch, wrestling the same railing screw we'd stripped twice already, so I heard everything, whether I meant to or not. Nolan, Sadie's voice did something I'd never once heard it do before, went careful in a way that told me more than any explanation could have. He was tall in the way that photographs well, hair cut like he paid someone specifically to make it look uncut, and he smiled at her like 18 months hadn't happened, like whatever ended between them had been a scheduling conflict and not whatever it actually was. I heard about the house situation, he said. Small world. My firm handles some of Holloway's financing. I set the drill down very quietly. You're kidding, Sadie said, and not in the delighted way. Wanted to give you a heads up before the offer goes final. And, honestly, to see you. It's been a while. His eyes moved past her, found me on the porch, and something in his expression recalibrated the way expressions do when a person is doing quick, unflattering math about who they're looking at. This is Caleb, Sadie said, my neighbor. Not my boyfriend, not my anything. My neighbor, which was true and stung more than I expected it to. Standing there with a stripped screw in my hand and paint on my shirt, while Nolan Griggs looked at me like I was a mildly interesting fact he'd need for later. Nolan recovered fast, the way people like him always do, and turned back to Sadie like the interruption had barely registered. I could look at the paperwork for you. No charge, obviously. Wouldn't want you getting steamrolled by a company I happen to work for. Sadie's jaw set in a way I was only just learning to read. I think I can manage a lease, Nolan. Never said you couldn't. I just know how these firms operate from the inside. You knew how I operated from the inside too, she said, and you still needed 6 weeks to decide whether being scared with me was worth your time. That landed. I watched it land, watched something flicker across his face before the polish slid back down over it like a garage door easing shut. He didn't stay long. He left a card, told her to call if she wanted an actual advocate in this, which was its own small insult aimed at both of us, and drove off in the too-clean sedan. Sadie came and sat on the porch steps below where I was working, not next to me, and didn't say anything for a full minute. "He left because I got sick," she said finally, to the yard, not to me. 18 months ago, nothing dramatic in the end, just a bad month and a scare that turned out to be a false alarm. But for about 6 weeks, I genuinely thought I might be facing something serious, and she stopped, started again. He said he needed space to process it. We were engaged 4 months, Caleb. He needed space to process whether I might be sick, and I spent those 6 weeks finding out I wasn't, alone. And by the time I had good news, there was nobody left to tell. I came down off the ladder and sat next to her, close enough that our shoulders touched, and I didn't say anything for a while, because some things don't need a response, they need a witness. "So when Adeline says household," she said eventually, "when she says be a household for real, whatever that looks like, you should understand I'm not scared of the paperwork. I've done the paperwork before. I'm scared of doing it with someone who leaves the moment it stops being convenient." I thought about the letter still sitting on my kitchen counter upstairs, 30 days now down to 20, and about the coward's answer I'd given her 2 nights before on this exact porch. And I understood, with the kind of clarity that usually only shows up in the back of an ambulance when a single second matters, that if I didn't say something true in the next few minutes, I was going to lose the only thing on Thistlewood Lane that had ever actually mattered to me. "I have my own version of that story," I said. She looked at me for the first time since she'd sat down. "I figured you might," she said quietly. "You've got a very specific way of not talking about certain things. Not tonight." It wasn't a refusal, it was a promise, and I think she heard the difference, because she nodded and let it be, and reached over and laced her fingers through mine on the step between us. First time either of us had done it privately, just the two of us, without a street full of neighbors watching or a delivery mix-up to hide behind. The deadline moved up 9 days later, on a Thursday, in the form of a second letter, shorter and colder, informing us that Halloway had raised their offer and pressured Adeline into a new date, 6 days out, gutting most of the runway we thought we still had, because somebody at that company had apparently heard, through Nolan's firm, or through the kind of gossip that travels faster on a small street than anywhere else in the world, that the current tenants were exploring their option, and had decided to make it not worth exploring. I read it standing in the shared entryway, both our names on the envelope for the first time, correctly, on purpose, which Adeline must have done deliberately, and it should have felt like a victory, and instead felt like a countdown clock somebody had just slammed a fist into. 6 days. We didn't have anywhere close to the money, not separately, not even combined, not without both of us doing something neither of us had actually agreed to do yet, which was become, on paper and in fact, exactly what this street had assumed we already were. I found Sadie in her shop that night, surrounded by 3 different bank printouts and a calculator, looking up at me with an expression I recognized from work, the specific tired of someone doing math that refuses to add up no matter how many times you run it. "I can get maybe 60% of my half," she said. "If I take out everything, if I sell the Heidelberg press my grandfather left me, don't sell the press." It came out too fast, too certain, and she looked at me like the reaction surprised her as much as it surprised me. I didn't have a good answer for why it had come out that hard. I only knew that press was the one thing in that room that had ever belonged fully to her, unmixed up, unshared, hers alone, and something in me refused to let this situation cost her the single object on this street that had never once been a mistake. "Then what?" she said. not unkindly, just exhausted. Because I've run these numbers 11 times, and they only work one way. I knew what she meant. I'd known it since the second letter landed on the mat that morning. The bank would look at two combined incomes, one household, one address that had been listed as married for 3 years anyway, and the math would finally, actually work, the way it had apparently already worked for everyone on this street except the two of us. "I need a day," I said, which wasn't an answer either, and I watched something in her face close again, gently this time, resigned instead of hurt, like she'd expected exactly this and had simply been hoping, one more time, to be wrong about me. I spent that day at work with my hands doing the job, while the rest of me sat somewhere outside my own body, replaying a version of myself from 6 years earlier that I hadn't let out of its box in a long time. Her name had been Meredith. We'd met in nursing school, gotten engaged after a year together, and were 4 days from a wedding 200 people had already bought plane tickets for, the week of the final tux fitting, when I woke at 4 in the morning and understood, with total, silent certainty, that I was about to marry her because it was the next scheduled thing in both our lives, not because I could picture either of us happy at 70. I called it off. I did it in person, as kindly as a person can do something that cruel, and it didn't matter because I broke something in her I've never stopped being sorry for, and broke something in myself too, which was any ability to hear the words engaged, or married, or official, without my chest doing the exact thing it had done reading Adeline's letter. I hadn't told anyone that story in 3 years. I told Sadie that night, on the porch, in the dark, in a voice quieter than I meant it to come out. "I'm not scared of you. I need you to know that first." I made myself keep going. I'm scared of the version of me who says yes to the right shape of something instead of the right person. And 6 years ago, I couldn't tell the difference until 4 days before it was too late, and it cost a woman I did love, just not enough, the wedding she'd planned since she was 9 years old. Sadie didn't say anything. She sat very still, the way I imagine patients look, waiting to hear which way a diagnosis is going to fall. So when Adeline says, "Make it official," the words alone make it hard to breathe, not because of you, because I've never once in 6 years trusted myself to know the difference between loving someone and just really, really not wanting to be the one who leaves. The porch light buzzed overhead, the way it always had, the way it probably would whether or not either of us got to keep living underneath it. But I know the difference now. I think I've known it since the disposal, if I'm honest, and I was too much of a coward to say it out loud until Holloway Realty Partners handed me 6 days to figure out how to stop being one. She still didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just sat there, her hand an inch from mine on the step, neither of us closing that inch, both of us fully aware of exactly how much weight an inch can hold. "I'm not asking you to fix 6 years of me in one conversation," I said finally. "I just needed you to know why the word scares me, before you had to decide what to do about 6 days and a bank and a press you shouldn't have to sell." I stood up, because staying felt like asking for an answer I hadn't earned yet. And I went upstairs, and I didn't sleep. And somewhere below my own floorboards, for the first time in 3 years, I genuinely had no idea what the woman underneath me was thinking. 2 days passed. I'd like to tell you they were dramatic, that I paced, that I did something cinematic with the time, but mostly I just worked 2 back-to-back shifts because Priya's kid had a fever, and I needed somewhere to put my hands that wasn't a phone I kept not texting. I came home the second afternoon, a little after 2, still in my uniform, and her shop sign was turned to closed, which meant nothing and meant everything, the way small facts do when you're waiting on a bigger one. 4 days now. I checked the number without meaning to, the way you check a wound to see if it's still bleeding. I was halfway through changing out of my boots in my own apartment when I heard footsteps on the stairs, her stairs, the ones that led up to my door specifically, and not the shared entry, which she had never once climbed in 3 years. Not for soup, not for a package, not for any reason at all, because there had never been a reason for Sadie Winslow to knock on my door instead of the other way around. I opened it before she finished knocking. She stood there like she'd rehearsed this the whole way up the stairs and forgotten every word of it anyway. And she was holding 2 things, a manila envelope and a single index card, the kind she printed on the machine that had bested me completely a few weeks before. "I called the bank this morning," she said. "Combined household income, 1 property, appraised value. We clear it, barely, but we clear it." I opened my mouth and she kept going before I could get anything out, which I understood, because I think if she'd stopped talking she'd have lost her nerve, the same way I nearly lost mine on this exact porch 2 nights earlier. But I'm not doing the paperwork because Adeline already had us filed that way. And I'm not doing it because 6 days turned into 4 and the math finally works. I've spent 18 months furious at a man who left because loving me stopped being convenient. And I am not about to build the rest of my life around a spreadsheet just because the timing happened to line up. She held up the index card. I could see the type on it. Small and precise, set by the same hands that had printed 400 strangers' wedding invitations without ever once setting a line of type for herself. "I made this instead of texting you because I wanted it to be something you could hold on to instead of something that disappears when your phone dies." Her voice cracked exactly once, right there, and she let it. 3 years. This street has had us filed as married. I used to think that was the mail carrier's mistake. I don't think that anymore. She held the card out. I took it. Set in her own small, deliberate type, it read, "Can we make it official? Not the loan, not the lease. Us." I looked up from the card to her face, and neither of us said a word for a second. The street outside gone quiet the way Thistlewood Lane only did in that lull between the school bus and supper. And I thought about Meredith and the tux fitting and 6 years of flinching every time somebody said the word official out loud, and understood, standing in my own doorway holding a hand-printed card from the only person who'd ever made that word feel like a door opening instead of one closing. That I wasn't scared anymore. Yes, just that, at first, because I needed her to hear it plainly before I said anything else. To all of it, the loan, the lease, the house, and you, in whatever order you want me to sign for them. She laughed, wet and surprised, and stepped forward into the 4 feet of space that had separated our 2 front doors for 3 years, and I met her halfway, which felt, after everything, like exactly the right distance to have finally closed. The mailbox out front has both our names on it now, in Sadie's own letterpress type. Ashford and Winslow, 42 Thistlewood Lane. No A, no B. Nothing left over for anyone to mix up. Theo still leaves everything in one basket by the shared door, because some habits outlast the reason for them, except most mornings, since there's nobody downstairs waiting on a separate name. Adeline finally saw that heart specialist in Charlotte and came back more stubborn than before, which I hadn't thought was possible, and told us over tea that she'd like her next tenant, whenever we eventually rent out the downstairs unit properly, to be someone half as slow as we were about the obvious thing. I think about the letter that started all of it more than I expected to. The one stamped final notice that I almost didn't open in time, and I've come around to believing the mistakes worth keeping are usually the ones you almost correct and never do. The ones that sit under a stack of seed catalogs for 3 years until one Tuesday morning finally makes you look at them straight on. Last week I came downstairs after a night shift to find Sadie on the shared porch in the early light, running her thumb along the edge of a fresh set of wedding invitations for somebody else's wedding. And when she heard my boots on the stairs, she didn't look up right away, just held one out to me between 2 fingers, careful of the wet edge. Careful, last time you touched one of these, you ruined an entire run. I sat down beside her on the step where an inch of space used to mean something and doesn't anymore, and took the card from her hand anyway. Some mistakes, I said, are worth the risk. She smiled at that. The real one, the kind it had apparently taken 3 years and one letterpress card and one very stubborn landlady to actually earn. Theo's truck idled at the curb the way it did most mornings now, except this time he leaned out the window instead of walking up. "Got something for the Ashfords," he called, waving an envelope, and neither of us corrected him, because for once, after 3 years, there was nothing left to correct. Sadie took it from him on her way back to me, glanced at the return address, and laughed outright. "Wedding registry catalog," she said, "for absolutely nobody's wedding," and dropped it on the step between us like it belonged there, which, I supposed, it finally did. Out past the porch rail where Mrs. Alvarez's hydrangeas kept right on doing exactly what they wanted, same as always, same as us.